Go ahead, Ruben.
Welcome to this CACOR seminar. There are two reasons I'm honored to be this week's host of the CACOR conversation. First, this series is becoming the most significant ongoing weekly conversation in Canada about truly important issues of our time. Please draw it to the attention of others. Second, as host, it's my duty and pleasure to introduce to you Robert W. Sandford, now a resident of Canmore, Alberta. We're in for a treat today. Bob has been called the Winston Churchill of water, and rightly so. He uses language, as did Churchill, not only to inform, but to touch and move us both to deeper reflection and to action. As you will hear, Bob knows we must be moved from the path we are on. And yes, Bob drips with status and battle scars. I shall mention just a few to give you some feel for his formal work. Bob Sandford holds the Global Water Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at the United Nations Institute on Water, Environment, and Health. In his work, Bob is committed to translating scientific research outcomes into language decision makers can use to craft timely and meaningful public policy. To this end, Bob is also senior advisor on water issues to the Interaction Council, a global public policy forum composed of more than 30 former heads of state, including Canada's Jean Chrétien, US President Bill Clinton, and former Prime Minister of Norway, Gro Brundtland. Bob is also author and co-author and editor of more than 30 books, one of which, Vanishing Glaciers, The Snows of Yesterday, and the Future Climate of the Mountain West, won the Lane Anderson Award for the best science writing in Canada in 2017. But you also need to know that the wellspring of his life is a deep and abiding connection to the earth. This comes from long experience in the backcountry that has given him a deep sense of place. You will see that he is drawn to and engaged in intractable issues. He has developed the capacity to see them whole, to explore them, to chew on them, to understand them, and to weep over them. I am privileged to know him as a friend. I give you Bob Sandford.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous and kind introduction, Ruben. It's a pleasure to work with you, and it's an honor to be invited to speak to this very prestigious audience. So please allow me to begin by extending the very best wishes of the United Nations to all. In accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, I wish to acknowledge from the outset that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures which constitute the common heritage of humankind. And it's to the common heritage of humanity that I wish to direct my remarks today. That said, if I may, I would like to make an observation on the intention and potential force of the land acknowledgements, which are now becoming common around the world. While this new practice is of great importance in and of itself as a sign of respect, it can be and can do even more. Land acknowledgement should be seen as more than the politics of recognizing historic territoriality. Such acknowledgement can be more than just about the past. It can be about the present and the future. It should acknowledge the relationship between land and people. It should be about our common intention on the landscapes we share. It should be about how each of us now, in our time, will add on a layer of experience, knowledge, and narrative to the map of place. So in that context, please allow me to explain my work, I should say, of the entire global water and climate community, begins with science. And it seems to me that the commandments of science can be reduced to two: tell the truth and stand up for all humanity and the planet now and generations into the future. Good science involves not just the sharing of knowledge about the world. It is a candle we light when we want to see and be warmed by the truth. But we know now that modern science is not the only way of knowing. Scientific knowledge alone will not be enough to get us through the bottleneck in which we presently find ourselves in the human journey. More than at any other time in history, we need to braid together all of humanity's ways of knowing and caring. We need to bring indigenous and local wisdom as well as scientific knowledge to bear on the challenge of ensuring sustainable human presence on this planet, a presence that depends utterly on water. So if the truth matters, what do I hold to be true? Well, I believe what young people are telling us. National Public Radio in the United States recently reported the results of a survey of 10,000 young people in 10 countries. 8 of every 10 surveyed told researchers that people have failed to take care of the planet. 8 of 10 also stated that for them, the future's frightening. Half thought humanity was doomed. 4 of 10 claimed to be reluctant to have children because of their fear of climate change. Keeping these emotions down, it was noted, would be like trying to push an inflated ball underwater. Young people have a right to be afraid. If we do not do the right thing right now, in terms of anticipating climate change impacts on water security, we could soon live in a world so changed that much of the history, literature, and culture that has enriched our lives may no longer be relevant anymore, because the very landscapes upon which our heritage was established will have changed. The places that we so love, the places in which we've established our identity and sense of place, may longer be as we knew them ever again. And we as people will not be the same. Indigenous people know that addressing these matters is a matter of cultural survival. If there's no future for Indigenous peoples and values, then there's no futures for anyone. And while the next generation sees that, many of the rest of us don't see it quite yet. But addressing these matters is truly a matter of cultural survival for all. And for that reason, I need to speak my truth directly. And what I found is that I can no longer soft pedal the climate threat so as not to trouble or frighten people. I admit openly that I'm deeply alarmed and I need to explain why. That said, I firmly believe that we can understand the global problem we face and we can address it, and we can do so in a way that will benefit and improve the lives of all. In my view, the most immediate risk is that our society will allow itself to lapse into some different but still functionally unaltered version of what we had before the pandemic. We can't allow that to happen, if only because we've altered and now live in an altered global water cycle. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, it's been my hope that what is happening globally to all of humanity would positively change societal direction everywhere. I had hoped it would allow us to see that we live in a global civilization on a planet we share that is in danger, and that awakened by that clear realization, we could work together now in ways that were not possible in the past. Unfortunately, in terms of our transformational moment, global reset and the Future of Hope initiative, it would appear at the moment that if a major transformation is already happening, it's happening without us. The world is being transformed through the evolution of ever more deadly pathogens and by rapidly accelerating climate change. The world is changing, but we are not. And if so, we are not changing fast enough. And I can certainly say that where I live here in Alberta. So one would think that these challenges are enough for one generation. A new elephant has appeared in the room while we were distracted by the pandemic. Today, only 1% of the terrestrial Earth is considered uninhabitable. The projection is that climate heating will increase that number to as much as 20% in the future. The alarms went off years ago, but so far we've ignored them. Because of climate warming impacts, the habitable zone in the United States is already shrinking northward toward Canada. Much of South Florida, the Carolinas, the American West, and Southwest are projected soon to be barely habitable, at least at certain times of the year. And where will these people go? Well, they will go uphill into higher latitudes for cooler temperatures to avoid heat and wildfire, inland away from ever more violent hurricanes and rapid coastal sea level rise, and they will gravitate toward places with reliable water security. Sound like a place that you might know. And whether we like it or not, the people who want what we have were coming. And we should get ready because it will be hard to stop them. Then there's the global circumstance. The UN predicts 200 million involuntary human migrants by 2050. But we don't have to wait until then to see what that looks like. Many vulnerable people are on the move, regardless of their reasons for moving, and they end up settling in marginal high-risk areas where they're exposed to weather and climate hazards at a range of scales. The number of people classified as under crisis, emergency, and famine conditions has increased to 135 million people in 55 countries. In 2020, 50 million people were doubly hit by both climate-related disasters and by COVID-19 disruptions. And what we see also is that the COVID problem exacerbated the effects of climate disruption during and along the entire food supply chain, elevating levels of food insecurity, malnutrition, and undernourishment. What we've seen in the last 2 years is that development in much of the world has been set back by as much as 25 years. And if we don't come up with solutions soon, it will mean that in parts of the world, becoming a refugee could mean that you are permanently a refugee, living perpetually with compound risks and vulnerabilities. So, and you can see 2020 was, if it was any indication, that we are truly heading into a perfect storm. And if in Canada we want to get ahead of that storm, the first thing we ought to recognize is that it's coming and we need to prepare for it. It wasn't long into the pandemic that we were reminded once again that one crisis doesn't simply end with the arrival of another. While we seemed to soon to be on top of the pandemic by June, we suddenly realized that COVID and the climate disruption were actually a tag team. And while COVID took a bit of a rest to brew up more lethal variants and anti-vaxxers queued up in parades to expose themselves to them, the pandemic tagged climate heating and it thundered into the ring stronger than ever. COVID put into relief the gap, not just between the rich and the poor. Climate change has exposed the growing gap between the expectations of the young and the old. And if you somehow hadn't noticed by June that the global climate has begun to change, this was further confirmed with the release of the IPCC Assessment Review 6. Climate change is clearly an experiment we should not be conducting. Assessment Review 6 reported that climate change is widespread, rapid, intensifying, and accelerating. This is for real, and it's for good. And we are the cause. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. No one is safe. The Secretary General of the United Nations declared it code red for the planet. You just can't say it more clearly or plainly than that. And as if that wasn't already clear to anyone paying attention, we have this summer as a bolt upright reminder that the arrival of the new crisis does not mean the ones you're already facing are leaving the stage. This past summer, the climate disruption threat suddenly took over center stage. Not that we should be surprised. In an earlier act, the heat waves in 2018 were relentless. The June heat wave in Eastern Canada resulted in over 93 deaths in Quebec. Heat was matched by a lack of rain in the Canadian West, with the worst drought in 50 years in parts of the southern prairies. The summer of 2018 was also an object lesson on the direct climatic connection between water and its diametric and symbolic opposite, fire. If you don't have one, then you get the other. What set the summer of 2018 apart were the wildfires and the endless smoke that spread across 5 provinces and 2 territories for weeks on end. And it just kept coming. Fires are becoming hotter, bigger, and faster. And while constituting barely 3.5% of all the world's wildfires, megafires were nonetheless responsible for 95% of fire damage. And this is new because of breakthroughs in the science of climate attribution. It was determined that during the current decade, the combined effect of anthropogenic and natural climate forcing made extreme fire risk events in Western Canada 1.5 to 6 times as likely compared to a climate unaffected by human influence. So if you were looking for a smoking gun to confirm climate change, the summer of 2018 was it. Prominent climate scientists here began saying that their worst fears were being realized. The feedbacks they cautiously projected might further accelerate climate impacts over a longer time span were kicking in far earlier than expected. Many claimed that 2018 may be a turning point in human history. Several offered that it was in this year that humanity may have crossed an invisible threshold into a new and dangerous climate regime in the Northern Hemisphere, and that we have now entered an era of more severe, if not permanent, climate disruption. And after that summer that wasn't, many were thinking about where we were headed and just how fast we might get there. Well, getting there didn't take long, however, only 3 years. Heat waves now annually kill people by the thousands in concentrated urban areas all over the world. Rising levels of urban heat are now seen to constitute the single greatest climate-related threat to human health globally. And we don't have to wait for the future to see that even here. It's happening now. Remember, this is Canada, the land of ice and snow. And under the June heat dome, 700 people died of heat stress in the greater Vancouver area alone. By only a few days into July, 300 all-time high temperature records had been broken in British Columbia, 125 more in Alberta. And these records were not just broken, they were shattered day after day, ultimately by as much as 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. By Canada Day on July 1st, 4 million British Columbians and 10 million people in Western Canada alone had been exposed to a major extreme weather event. And then suddenly temperatures reached 49.6 degrees in Lytton, BC. I don't need to tell you that at 50 degrees Celsius, almost everything becomes a lot more combustible. The fire that destroyed Lytton was a top story around the world. The Guardian in Britain ran a headline that read, "Canadian Inferno, Northern Heat Exceeds Worst Case Climate Models." And the report was correct. Record temperatures of nearly 50 degrees Celsius exceeded the worst case scenarios of existing climate models, not just in Canada, but globally. Well, what we face is not over, and wasn't then. In June, there were 5,770 high temperature records broken in North America, most of them in the last few days of the month. Drought spread from Vancouver to Quebec, and many places crops started to fail. Then there was the prospect of more lightning sparking wildfire. On July 2nd, there were 170 new fires in British Columbia alone. Then suddenly there were 200. And don't forget the pyrocumulonimbus clouds that form over sources of high heat like hot wildfires. Pyrocumulonimbus clouds sparked 710,000 lightning strikes in 15 hours across British Columbia from 3 p.m. on June 30th to 6 a.m. on July 1st. And in the face of events like this, systems break down. People discover to their horror that they can lose everything in 15 minutes. And while climate deniers keep denying, unprepared governments prevaricate, emergency services falter, transportation routes become unreliable, people grow afraid, and their mental and physical health suffer. At a certain point, displaced people run out of places to go. But it didn't stop last summer with extreme events. There were other significant losses that went largely unnoticed. Research conducted by the Western Canadian Cryospheric Network has demonstrated that we lost some 300 glaciers in the mountain parks region of the Rockies alone in the 85 years between 1920 and 2005. Melted glacial ice makes more liquid water available to an already energized water cycle. The loss of glaciers is expected to continue, with over 90% of the ice that exists in the interior ranges of Canada's Western mountains expected to be gone by the end of the century, or so we thought. Global Water Futures released its recent observations on the recession of the Peyto Glacier, which is an outflow of the Watt ice field and one of the headwaters of the North Saskatchewan River, one of the most important river systems in Western Canada. These images, which were produced by global water researcher Philip Harder, using instrumented drone flyovers, make clear how fast climate warming is impacting established water security in the Canadian West. So here we see what the Peyto Glacier was like in 2019. Watch what happens next. This is how much of the Peyto retreated and down-wasted in 2020. Recession rates of this magnitude are not just beyond what I have witnessed in 50 years of observations. They're beyond that. Such rapid melt in a single year is unprecedented in the historical record. Now check this out. Over the last 25 years, the Peyto Glacier has receded on average 25 meters a year. In 2021, the Peyto Glacier receded 200 meters, 8 times the average loss over the last quarter century. It is also down-wasted 15 meters in only 2 years. This rate of glacial loss is unprecedented in the more than a century during which the dynamics of this glacier have been scientifically monitored. So this gives you an idea of how much the glacier has retreated and down-wasted, and how much down-wasting has occurred in the Peyto in only 2 years. At this rate of recession, researchers do not expect the Peyto Glacier to exist much beyond this decade. And by the end of this century, only 3% will remain of the Watt ice field from which it flowed since time immemorial. So it should be noted that the loss of glacial ice is a symptom of a much larger problem. The same warming that is causing our glaciers to disappear so quickly is reducing snowpack and the duration and extent of snow cover throughout the Mountain West. We have discovered that winter snows and mountain snowpacks thermoregulate the climate and define water security for the entire West. The West will soon be a very different place. Welcome to the future. So that future is here. What about elsewhere? Well, if you want to see what the future looks like for others, look no further than the American West. The drought that has gripped the American West has now become so deep and so persistent that it has put into relief so many compound, cumulative, and cascading effects that many are calling it the everything disaster. So what does that mean to us here in Canada? Well, we can no longer rationally deny that there's a linear relationship between carbon dioxide emissions and the increase in global surface temperature. To get through this bottleneck in the human journey, we too have to reach at least net zero carbon emissions and then begin to draw down the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we pumped into the atmosphere. Our failure to do so will not be costly just to us, but to the entire world. But our problems don't end there. Sometimes it's good to be reminded of the blunt facts that separate reality from illusion. As recent storms continue to demonstrate, civilizations exist by geological consent, a consent that is subject to change without notice. The Earth's climate system is utterly indifferent to human wishes, desires, and needs. Warnings issued by the climate community for the past 40 years have now to largely been ignored, and as a result, what scientists once projected to happen in the future is happening now. The future we feared and wanted at all costs to avoid has arrived. Presently, what we know and have projected has become like a lantern on the stern that only shines on the waves behind us. In November of 2019, 7 leading climate scientists published a review in the journal Nature, which stated that societal collapse may be inevitable because we have triggered 9 of 15 known climate tipping points that regulate Earth system function, which includes the global climate system. And as you can see, there are many of them. And if you examine how they are trending, you'll see that they've begun merging together. And if that trend continues, tipping points we have crossed will bring on a cascade of further feedbacks and impacts, many of which we can't yet anticipate. And that's why what is happening right now in our own Arctic demands our fullest attention. We call it Arctic amplification. The greenhouse release feedback caused by permafrost thaw in our Arctic has the potential to become a tipping point for the entire global climate system. Because of unprecedented warming in the past 2 decades, the staggering scale of thawing of permafrost has turned parts of the Arctic into a carbon source instead of a carbon sink. As one scientist put it, because of permafrost thaw, the Arctic has become an enormous carbon chimney. This is a feedback we don't want to get away on us. We need to keep that carbon where it is in the ground. And that's why what happened in early April of this year should be of great concern to all of us. On Wednesday, April 7th, 2021, NASA made it widely known that carbon dioxide concentrations in the global atmosphere for the first time in the entire history of humanity exceeded 420 parts per million. This despite being the second year of a pandemic that has slowed human activity to such an extent that it has reduced carbon dioxide by emissions by as much as 4% globally. So what does that mean? And why does that matter? Well, it means that self-reinforcing feedbacks originating and accelerating carbon emissions from what were previously carbon sinks like the Arctic will continue to increase independent of how much we as a society reduce our emissions, which means we need to decarbonize our society faster over the next decade than we were proposing even before COP. Now, many of on this webinar, because you're all very well experienced people, will know that the climate crisis is a water crisis. Canada, for all its much vaunted myth of limitless abundance of water, is actually facing a long-term water crisis. And if Canada is facing a water crisis, well, what's happening elsewhere? Well, lots. By heating the atmosphere, we have altered and accelerated the global water cycle. With precipitation patterns becoming more unpredictable, we can no longer take water security granted anywhere. As you know, it's all linked. Water and climate are inseparable from one another and from ecosystem function. And we are a long way from acting on that realization. Why? Because there's not enough of us who know and are prepared to argue the value of water. Check out this UN report. If there's a problem that contributes everywhere to our growing global water crisis, it's that we don't properly value water, or in many places even try to. Presently, it's all about monetization. This UN report found that failure to fully value water in all its different uses is, if not a root cause, at least a symptom of political neglect of water and its mismanagement. And all too often, the report found the value of water, or its full suite of multiple values, does not influence decision-making at all. The failure also extends to how we view the impacts of extreme climate events. We continue to monetize risk and resilience in terms of impacts on infrastructure and ignore the uncalculated impacts of these events on people and ecosystems for which no meaningful measurements appear to exist. So from this, we see that one of the greatest failures of our species appears at this critical moment in history to be that we still do not know how to value the role water plays in ecosystem function and climate stability, except in monetary terms. And we're not moving fast enough in the right direction to prepare for what is coming. So clearly we need a new paradigm. And the UN has frameworks that can help us in creating that paradigm. In essence, the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is both a moral and biological ecology. The Sustainable Development Goals form an organic whole. Each of its 17 distinguishing elements stand in relation to each of the others. And while it's possible and sometimes necessary to concentrate on just one, such as Goal 6 pertaining to water, the goals are intricately linked. They are not separate blocks that we can snap together. We realize now that all of these goals will continue to be moving targets unless we value and manage water better. And from this, we see that prolonged human existence on this planet is a package deal with water and its relationship to climate at its very center. So we need to use the UN's 2030 Transforming Our Global World Sustainable Development Agenda as a blueprint for global reset and the future of hope. And there's great urgency here. We need to change the direction we're going to make sure we never come this close to crossing the threshold of societal collapse again. And this is what takes us to COP26 and the climate issue. COP26 to date was the most important climate conference ever held. In many ways, it will define the future of the entire planet. We could not afford this to be another Munich moment where we hope for the best as we kick the climate can down the road. We have run out of road to kick the can down, but that unfortunately is to a large extent what we may have done. You will remember that climate science consensus was that the world has to reduce greenhouse emissions by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 in order to have a 66% chance of avoiding a cascade of extreme events that will be unstoppable in our lifetimes and beyond. It's not just scientists that are claiming that keeping warming below 2 degrees is critical. Munich Re, the world's largest reinsurance company, has announced that there is not enough money in the world to insure what needs to be insured at 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. This suggests that we face a different kind of Munich moment altogether. We should not confuse agreement with truth. It's interesting that perhaps distrustful of the UN member states and their ability to come to an agreement, climate decided to represent itself at COP26, and it's a good thing it did. While there remains a commitment to keep warming to between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius, the world wandered from its targets at COP26. Current nationally determined contributions to carbon dioxide emissions reductions to meet the Paris Agreement to date will, if fully honored and implement, and that means it remains a big if, the implementation, allow the Earth to warm, barring tipping points that get away on us, by 2.4 degrees Celsius by 2100. This projection, it must be pointed out, barely takes into account that the global domestic GDP is expected to rise by 60% and the global population to increase to 10 to 12 billion by 2060. So we see self-arrest in Glasgow. At the end of COP26, the only graceful way out of it for delegates was to accept a compromise that the burning of coal was not going to be phased out, but instead only phased down. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres ever optimistically conceded while COP26 was a disappointment, it remained a starting point. Those who reject the official optimism that's always expected countered that we've had 26 starting points. When are we going to start? Our hair should be on fire. At 2.4 degrees, we're going to subject half the world's current population to water security, while at the same time condemn our children and their children to hell on earth. This is what it has come to because we ignored the threat so long. Climate change is no longer just an environmental problem and can no longer be characterized solely as such. It has become an existential threat to the future of civilization and to life on Earth, and has the potential to become a planetary everything disaster. But on the other hand, the Secretary General is right. We need to separate what COP26 from what it wasn't. 20 years ago, like many of you, I was among a relatively tiny few immune to consensual reality with respect to Earth system collapse. Then only a tiny number of voices were crying out from the remote wilderness of climate science. We knew public discourse would have to reach at least the level and extent it is now beginning to have, but had no idea how it would or could even do so in time to prevent us as a society from pulling the planet down around us. We have made progress, but expanding global discourse notwithstanding, we have not yet broken the surface tension of climate change denial. We have to see that COP26 was just one more battle in an undeclared and very uncivil proxy war. Our old enemy, paid climate denialism, has shape-shifted again and now employs the weapons of disinformation, deflection, delayism, and doomism. And these tactics are, at the moment, appear to be winning the war. We have to see that engaging in this undeclared and highly uncivil war is a trap, And at COP26, that trap was set again. And in this regard, I cannot help but see sinister forces behind what was hidden in plain sight at COP26. The perception emerged long before COP26 that the fossil fuel sector has known exactly what externalities would be passed on to others in future generations from reliance on coal, oil, and natural gas, but purposely hid them and from them. And these unaccounted for costs to society we see now include massive threats to public health from pollution, contamination of ground and surface water, catastrophic events and impacts on marine ecosystems, heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and extreme flooding events as a consequence of climate heating, which they knew full well would trigger involuntary human migration on a scale for which humanity is utterly unprepared. But even though they knew their devastating effects, they ignored and denied these accelerating impacts. Why? Well, even though the sector knew full well what these externalities would be and are now in terms of calculating the real cost of its ongoing accumulation well beyond human imagination, it vigorously did everything possible within its public relations capacity to avoid any responsibility for liability for the ever larger bill it passed on an annual basis to those who had come to rely and be addicted to the energy the sector provided. And that bill, I should point out, is now estimated to have been US $2 trillion in the last decade for damage to infrastructure from extreme events alone. This on top of the $3 trillion the G20 has given to the fossil fuel sector subsidies since 2015. And for its part, Canada granted 18 billion in subsidies in 2020 alone. That doesn't end the story. The sector remains so entrenched that it's pronounced that it alone has the technology, knowledge, and infrastructure in place globally to address the climate disruption threat. Arguing that they should be trusted to bring society back from the brink of climate disaster, they're putting forward that carbon capture and storage, or CCS as they call it, is the perfect solution because it allows them to profit from recovering more oil in deep formations and profiting again through sequestration of whatever CO2 they can capture from continuing to burn that oil. In other words, you get your cake and eat it. This, oil executives have crowed, is how the sector intends to go from climate pariah to climate savior. I have been on webinars where senior oil executives rubbing their hands together have stated clearly that if they can sell the concept of carbon capture and storage to an oil-addicted world, it would more than double the size and the profits of the oil and gas sector. Addicts owned by their own pushers. Can't wait for that. Imagine an economic sector already completely out of control, doubling in size at the potential cost of human presence on the planet. And this plan seems to be working. They have convinced many countries to rely on technologies that are either unproven, don't work at scale, haven't been invented yet, or simply impossible violation of the laws of thermodynamics to meet national net zero targets by 2050. They're reluctant to admit it. Some countries plan to wait until the 2030s and 40s to cut emissions so as to give these as yet unproven technologies time to mature or come into existence. These business as usual based technologies includes all kinds of dangerous geoengineering schemes, including the fantasy of direct air capture, or DAC. Climate researchers are more than just skeptical that DAC will work. As with a raft of other faux green engineering, geoengineering technologies that are being hawked on social media, machines that miraculously suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere will never fulfill their purpose. And to understand why, you've got to consider the size of the atmosphere. It's very big, roughly 5.5 quintillion tons of mixed gases. But the carbon dioxide concentration, for all its powerful effects, is very small. This morning at only 415 parts per million, and humanity is responsible for releasing about 40 billion tons of it every year. So we can go to the next slide, Ruben. So any machine that's going to attempt the task of sucking the air out, even assuming 100% efficiency, would need to hoover up 22,470 tons of atmosphere just to capture 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And in order to make a difference, and you have to do this roughly 1,000 times a second to keep up with our ongoing emissions. It's not going to happen. Cheaper, more beneficial ways are available to us, including to just stop burning fossil fuels. So techno-optimists funded by the fossil fuel sector are trying to focus on emerging technologies to distract us from the weaknesses of existing ones. And sadly, many nations out of desperation are buying the false promise. Meanwhile, others, because they don't have the means to do otherwise, and no one will step in enough to help them, are simply kicking the can down the road a half a century. But as I said, we're running out of road. So if you're a head of state or government and think we can endure another 50 years of the kinds of accelerating impacts we witnessed in Canada this summer and in parts of British Columbia right now, then perhaps you should be facing charges of crimes against humanity at the World Court in Hague. Just look at BC today. People missing, infrastructure ruined, entire towns flooded, rail lines washed out, no power, no mobile, hundreds rescued by helicopters. These poor people. Welcome to the future indeed. So it's time we realize that the thinking, engineering ideologies that got us into this jam are not going to get us out of it. We have to come down to earth before the earth system brings us down. And that's where we come in, all of us. What we desperately need now is informed, fearless, and relentless citizenship in the service of visionary, adaptive, and reciprocal leadership. We must be those citizens and those leaders. We must stop taking the denialist bait, refuse to engage in these tactics and this war, and sue for climate peace on our terms. And we should start by asking which is better: business as usual and runaway climate heating, endless killer heat waves, wildfires, and floods, or cleaner air and a stable climate. Business as usual and hundreds of millions of climate refugees, mass starvation, and endless human conflict, or peace and greater global security. Misery for our children and their children, or hope now and for the future. So dealing with the threat of global heating, we see as rather like trying to land a plane in a hurricane. As it happens, it falls to us, all of us who are on this webinar, to do that. We must fly that plane. It's up to us to find the words and the ways to prevent our society from falling pell-mell, every man for himself, into a future we neither planned nor desire. This must be our finest hour. One of my Canadian colleagues, Dr. John O'Riordan, likes to characterize our current circumstances by quoting the opening paragraph from Charles Dickens' 1859 classic, A Tale of Two Cities. And his estimation of how these are the best of times, he cites the fact that there has been a rapid growth in disruptive technologies, especially in the domains of solar and wind power generation, storage batteries, and transportation efficiency. There have been breakthroughs in the understanding of natural regeneration and the harnessing power of forests, grasslands, and wetlands to sequester carbon, and advances in natural climatic solutions that include regenerative agriculture. At the same time, there's been a shift toward stakeholder capitalism that focuses less on stakeholder value and more on people and the planet. There's also a growing realization that we must move from self-interest to public interest, or we will risk rolling societal collapse. And that outcome can no longer be discounted. Rolling collapse would bring on the worst of times indeed. So, as we move to conclusion, where exactly does hope reside in this grimly uncertain picture? We are on the cusp of great change. After centuries of dominance, we're on the way to replacing the mechanistic worldview with one that is life-affirming, based on deep recognition of humanity's interconnectedness with the living earth. And I think it's important to say that we need to be positive and patient. Those alive during the Industrial Revolution do not realize until nearly a century later the changes that were wrought in their time. Similarly, it's not impossible that because we're in the middle of the transformation, we can't yet see its outlines. The mobilization of hope is a precondition of effective action, and there's much to be hopeful about. Well, COP didn't succeed as many would have liked. Global cooperation didn't collapse either. One positive thing that clearly came out of COP26 is a much greater intergenerational awareness of the seriousness of the global climate problem. There is still time, this is still a time when new ideas brought forward by a new generation can still have outsized impacts. And perhaps the most important thing the watching and waiting world can take away from COP26 is that the cavalry of global climate solidarity is not coming, at least not yet, to save us. In the meantime, we're on our own in the regions in which we live, in our cities, our neighborhoods, and in our homes. And we are faced with this question. In the absence of a global willingness to address the climate threat, what strategies do we need to devise on our own to deal with the impacts of an increasingly unstable climate that will allow us to protect ourselves from extreme events and assure water security where we live? If COP26 tells us nothing else, it tells us we better get to work and protect and save ourselves, our families, our neighborhoods, and our communities, because it will be in them that we will have to make our stand. We should see this as an exciting time. If we want to see the best of times in perpetuity, we know what we have to do. We know now what Indigenous peoples have known for thousands of years. We can reduce and moderate the threat of climate disruption by protecting, restoring, and constantly rehabilitating natural system function. And from this, we can see that this is not the end of the world by any means. It's just the beginning of another. There's great power in realizing this, for it is at the local level, the level which all of us ultimately work, that we have the most power to affect change and to act most effectively in service of where and how we live and who we love now and in the future. We need to meet net zero emissions reductions where we live globally. To achieve that goal, all national net zero plans have to demonstrate first that we have reached the most important tipping point of all, our tipping point, the point at which enough of us see we're at a point of no return with respect to climate disruption, and finally take collective action before it threatens to end human presence on the planet. While we are cutting emissions, we have to establish a new form of capitalism based on a circular economy, build a new world order based on international cooperation, reconcile our relationship with the earth and with one another, and in particular with Indigenous peoples. We need to learn to live with nature and base adaptation on community cohesion and vision. We cannot deny, however, that we are present at a crossroads and we're running out of time. We need to get on top of this pandemic and get ahead of climate disruption before it gets ahead of us, and while we can still afford to do so. We live in one of the places in the world where we can still do that, but to create and have hope, we need to work together, all of us. What we urgently need now is a second, new, and very different enlightenment. But no enlightenment can proceed without a renaissance. We, all of us, need to be part of that next renaissance, that new and wiser beginning. A better world is possible. To make that world possible, however, we need to harness the energy, clear-sighted intelligence, and courage of our youth. They are our future. This is a transformational moment for all of humanity. Let us seize it. Thank you.
Let me invite you to sit in silence for 2 minutes and digest what Bob has said. Thank you. Thank you, Bob. The Winston Churchill of water, indeed. So we come to questions. There are a host of questions, I'm sure, in all of us, touching all of the many important things you said. John Meyer, you asked a question in the chat. If you would share your video and sound and ask your question to Bob. And Dave Doherty, you will be up.
Okay, thanks, Bob. That was absolutely marvelous. I'd like to make 2 points before I make I ask my question. The first, in the absence of Charlie Hall, I'd like to point out that the EROI, energy return on energy invested, of fossil fuel systems, once you tag carbon capture onto the back end, becomes unviable. Second point is that the Renaissance, which launched our society in the direction it has gone, progressive direction it has gone, was preceded and occurred in the middle of the global crisis of the 1600s, which saw huge population decline, social chaos, almost constant warfare. So it would be nice to have our Renaissance before that happens, but the first Renaissance took place after that was well underway, I believe. My question, this is more for the converted, but it might give us another tool. Given the increase in the rate of rainfall and the rate of runoff, what rainfall we get tends to be more concentrated now, more intense. Is there any kind of aridity index being developed to illustrate the rapid switch from high runoff to drought-like conditions, causing forest fires and this sort of thing? Is there anything that gives us a new tool? Is there a new tool, a new indicator we can get out of the changing pattern of rainfall towards higher levels of, or just greater extremes in rainfall and drought?
That's a very good question, and it's an essential question to answer, because we need to be able to answer that question, because we know we've lost a hydrologic stationarity, so things are not going to be as they were in the past. What we have been relying on in terms of that are new and more sophisticated, better models. And what our models show is pretty much what you're saying, is that the world, some places are going to be wetter, and what we're going to see here, for example, in this country, we're going to see more rainfall as precipitation as opposed to snow in the winter. We're seeing here, for example, that the upper altitudes, the snowpack is staying on, but we're getting earlier melt, and also valley floors are warming up. We have 40% less snow cover in the valley floors here than we did in the 1960s. That said, the precipitation patterns are likely to increase, and there's so much to say about your question, but one of the things that we've discovered is you have intact ecosystems, the hydrologic systems stay stable. And here, for example, because we have the mountain national parks and the relatively stable ecosystems, we've been able to observe a 4 degrees Celsius temperature increase in winter minimum temperatures, and no change in the hydrology. But we're going to see there's going to be more water in the atmosphere, obviously, because of the fact that every time you raise the atmospheric temperature 1 degree, the atmosphere will carry 7% more water. So what we're going to see is you're going to see some places with the same average annual precipitation, but they will come in bigger bursts, between which there'll be drought conditions in many places. So how are we going to deal with this? What kind of models? Well, we have drought index models that tell us now, but that's more after the fact. I mean, that can tell you what's happening right now, And you can look at those models, they're all over the place. The best one, of course, with the USGS. But what we also see is that new models, we are working through Global Water Futures on the holy grail of modern hydrology, which is to be able to give real-time forecast, drought and flood forecasting and prediction. And those models are coming together, and we hope within the next 2 to 3 years, we'll be able to have that so farmers can know in April what we can expect in terms of climate conditions at seeding time. And we'll also hopefully be able to put into indication what places where we're going to have the most severe droughts and what we can do about them. There's a lot more I could say about that question, but I hope that's good enough for you. Is it?
No, that's great. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Dave Doherty, if you would be ready, you would ask your question, and Zach Jacobson, you'll be up next.
Hi, thanks, Bob. Great talk. Thank you. Pulled a lot of things together, a number of things of which I hadn't thought before. But one thing I did think about before is that David Schindler, I'm pretty sure you would know the guy, formerly at the University of Alberta and previously at Environment Canada, once speculated that all of the major cities in the Canadian prairies would lose their mountain-fed water supplies this century. And I wonder what you see as their prospects.
Well, first of all, I have to thank you for bringing up David Schindler. He's one of the reasons why I work in water, and he's such an inspiration, and he's done so much for inspiring generations of those people who follow after him in hydrology and ecosystems. And I remember the first time I heard him make that prediction, it was in Saskatoon. And I remember it sucked the air right out of the room. Nobody could even imagine that. But what we're seeing is dramatic decreases in the average flows of all of the rivers that have their, the 9 major rivers that flow out of the Western Mountains. And what we're seeing also is a change in the timing of the water. The spring freshet happens up to 3 weeks earlier, and then it falls off dramatically. And for example, we look at this year in Calgary, the Bow River flowing through that city is 50% lower than it normally would be on average at this time of the year. So the answer to your question is yes. And if we continue to have accelerated climate warming, I think you could see that those major cities would be in very serious trouble by late August. And water supplies would be very precious indeed. And as I said, that in association with heat rises and ecosystem changes. I mean, we looked at this, and one of the studies said that Fort McMurray would have relatively the same climate and the same ecosystems as Medicine Hat does now. You'd see extensive drying across much of the plains. And as I keep saying, this is going to change the Canadian West more than even European settlement did.
So then for the cities themselves, do you think they're going to become depopulated? Or if I remember correctly, I think Dr. Schindler said they might be abandoned.
Well, we still waste an awful lot of water in these cities. I mean, you look at the amount of water that goes in a city like Calgary or Toronto, they overbuild their water infrastructure by as much as 40% to be able to accommodate summer lawn watering and landscaping. And we see this also even in places that are really dry like Kelowna. So there are things that must be done and can certainly be done to bring about greater economy of water use. That would happen first. And abandoning cities, that one I haven't got my head around yet, Dave. But
we have lots of examples of it from the past, of course.
We certainly do. And you look at the intensification of summer heat, and you begin to understand just how critical that runoff is from the mountain regions. I mean, there are places in the prairies, as you well know, that they don't have a stream flow. I mean, they're so dry that there's no contribution to local rivers. And so consequently, we wouldn't have the irrigation that we have here and much of the agriculture. And we certainly wouldn't have big cities like this were it not for the amount of water and its reliability. And glacial loss, as you clearly saw, and we talked about yesterday. this is going to have a very significant impact. 1% of the flow of water in Calgary is considered on an annual basis to come from glaciers. But that's these annual averages, what we're talking earlier about hydrological rules of thumb no longer count, because in Banff, the stream flow might have been contributed by 25% by glaciers, and in September and August and September, and that's when you really need to have water for agriculture too.
Would be a real shame to lose Peyto Glacier. I have a picture of myself and my family on the overlook with that marvelous water.
Well,
Thank you.
I don't think you're going to see it. I think you're going to see it gone by the end of this decade.
Mhm.
Thank you. Zach, if you would unmute, and Rick Carpenter, you'll be up next.
Peyto Glacier and Lake are one of our favorite places. That's listen, indeed, this was Churchillian talk. Thank you very, very much. But I'm glad you mentioned the problems of thermodynamics and direct air capture and carbon sequestration. I've been thinking for quite some time that any effort to draw carbon dioxide out of the air, those two ways are hopeless. And it is exactly for the physics, the thermodynamics of it. And yet the carbon dioxide is there. It will warm us, even if it stopped going in now, which it won't. It will warm us much too much in the future. It's got to come out. I'm hoping that there are some more natural ways of getting the carbon dioxide out. The sorts of ocean fertilization that Anita Thorhag does around the edges of the continent, the sorts of deep ocean fertilization that are only thought of. These will be said to be technologies, and technology got us into this. So technology shouldn't be able to get us out. But we're going to need some way to get that carbon dioxide out of the air. What do you suggest?
Well, first of all, it's really interesting you bring this up, because the whole subject of geoengineering needs to be really examined more carefully and more publicly. And I don't disagree with you that technological solutions are helpful, but it's really fascinating to note that the U.S. National Academies just had published a very serious report on geoengineering and whether or not we should be exploring it and experimenting with it. And it was a very tense debate. There are a lot of negative reasons for it, which I could go through if you want. But on the positive side, not all geoengineering experiments were deemed to be dangerous. Some possible research avenues, such as cloud brightening with seawater, could be conducted on a local basis off the California coast, for example, with controllable short-term effects. And this research can definitely prove whether or not we should ever employ solar geoengineering of any kind. And the arguments that are behind this are the fact that there's also a real risk here that even modest investments in this will lead to unintended consequences. And unintended consequences are still consequences. So the question becomes this: once you start down this slippery slope, how do you prevent unintended outcomes? And with any form of solar geoengineering, for example, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere stays in the atmosphere, and the effects will come back and hammer you the moment you stop applying the geoengineering application.
That's absolutely true, but I'm talking about other ways of getting the carbon dioxide out.
Yeah, no, and I think we should, and the academies, national academies agree that research into this needs to be done, and we need to do it carefully. But we also point out that we don't have any control over it. And there are noticed with COP and with the pandemic, there's no global leadership in these things, and there are no, for example, there's no global policies or regulations on it. And I just want to make one comment. Zach, I agree completely that we should do this, and it's taken me some time to go into that, but it certainly has. But here's the logic that's being used in a lot of the cases. It goes like this: no football team likes to be down 6 points with 4 seconds left on the clock and left only with a Hail Mary pass. So we are looking at these geoengineering options as Hail Mary passes. And it is, we don't want to push ourselves to the wall where we have to imagine these plays and push these. So we have to be careful as we advance the research.
I'm sorry. That's exactly where I think we are. Not 6 points down, 12 points down with 4 seconds left. I'm sorry. To say we've got other things that we can try and not be considering these things already is already death.
You know, many people agree with you on that. And the way things are going right now, it might very well prove to be the case.
If I may, one of the questions in the chat connects with this. So to move from geoengineering, are there, some people talk about new ways of sequestering carbon through agriculture or through different uses or different ways to tend the land. Do you see that as being hopeful, not just in the sense of keeping in the soil that's already there, but actually drawing down from the atmosphere additional carbon?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because it really does respond to Zach's points also. What we have seen is that we have caused so much soil damage and the loss of soil microbes, et cetera, which are capable of absorbing massive amounts of carbon dioxide, that some UN reports say that if we continue on this direction, that we'll only have 60 more summers of productive agriculture on natural soil health. And the point that is being made here is that by restoring soil health, we can perhaps take 25%, as much as 25% of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through regenerative agriculture. And there's another thing that doing that too. Afforestation, of course, has a lot to do with that, and revitalizing natural ecosystem function will do that. And there's some hopeful signs there. A year ago, there was a study done that said that we could probably meet 10% of Canada's carbon dioxide reduction targets by natural means, and by stimulating those natural means. And the latest report that we've got now says 30%. So we're finding out more how to do it, and we're also getting better at measurements. So there's a lot of things that can be done, and also marine circumstances, et cetera, that we brought up that we can explore. And there's not going to be one thing that we do. Again, I think all of us would agree that there's no Hail Mary pass, there's no single silver bullet. There's going to be a lot of things if we're going to skate through this particular bottleneck in our human existence.
Thank you. Rick, if you would ask your question, and Bill Reese, you'll be up next.
Bob, I'd like to join the chorus of compliments on your talk. And my question may not be answerable given the rather grim discussion that has taken place. However, you may be familiar with a book by Parag Khanna called Move, recently published, in which, and you have hinted at this, there will be much migration. And sorry about that. And that in his view, Canada is one of the places that will be particularly attractive for migrants. There will also be migration coming north from the United States, given what we have heard in your talk today. Would you care to venture an opinion about where in Canada would be the most attractive place if you were advising younger people who could choose? Would it be around the Great Lakes, for example?
Well, first of all, I have that book. I haven't read it yet. And I'm going to now, especially since you brought it up. This is a very interesting question. For nearly 30 years, I've been asked that question, and mostly by people who want to speculate in real estate. And it's quite interesting to see that. I think what I would do to ascertain exactly where those places are, I would see where the 0-degree isotherm is across the country, and then see what it would be like at 4 degrees warmer, see where that isotherm resides, and then look for places with water and good agricultural soil. So might want to go to the Yukon, might want to go to the lower reaches of the Athabasca system. You might want to look for those places, but it's definitely going to be north. And that's where I would look. I would look for water, agricultural possibilities so that you can be more independent and food secure. And that's the type of place I would be looking. I hope that's an answer to your question. Yes,
Richard Romer was quite prophetic, talking about north of 60 all those years ago, the Acres project. It's coming to pass.
Well, unfortunately, and I think everyone on this call will know this, but you know, the general sense is that agriculture is going to move north and that Canada is going to benefit hugely from that. But you got to remember what soil health is. Yes. And a lot of, as you move north, there's hard rock. That's hard to farm. And so you've got to be able to know where the soil types are and where the vegetation is going to move and what's going to move with it. And you've got to watch what's going to happen with water.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bill Reese, if you will ask your question, and Meg, you will be up next.
Thank you very much, Ruben and Robert, for an excellent summary of our predicament. Listen, we live in a world in which the agencies you work for expect energy use to increase by 50% by mid-century. The economy is expected to double by mid-century, which means, roughly speaking, a doubling of energy and material throughput through economic activity. We expect the population to increase by 2.5 billion by mid-century. We're just talking 20 or 30 years from now. My question is this then: is there any way whatsoever to solve the human predicament, and really it's a predicament for all of life, from within the self-referencing paradigm, which is to say the beliefs, values, and assumptions of modern growth-based techno-industrial society?
Well, first of all, let me tell you how much respect I have for your work. And I've read you a great deal, and especially I've got to tell you your assessment about where we're going wrong at COP was one of the most insightful that I'd read. And I want to say that what you said about that, about using the same mindsets that we have used to get into this situation, and how we just seem to be so blind to how we're bound by these traditions and ways of thinking. And also, I have to say that Ruben Nelson speaks a great deal about that. And I watched his presentation, and I've talked to him widely on exactly this subject. So what I honestly think, Bill, because I could be nothing but fully honest on that one, I really think that we're in real trouble. I think Ronald Wright's metaphor perfectly captures our plight. We climbed the ladder of progress and we kicked the rungs out below, leaving ourselves with no non-catastrophic way back to a less complex mode of existence. And you know, we're in the cusp of a mega crisis brought around by the coincidence to failure, the failure to govern ourselves as a planetary civilization, and our inability to deal with public health crisis, the increasing divisiveness in our society, climate change, and the loss of ecological fictions. And, you know, I look at William Ophel's book, The Apologies to Our Grandchildren. I don't know if many of you probably read it. And, you know, he says that those who governed us were saints advised by genius, and the populace were eager to embrace change. There might be some possibility of turning this epochal crisis into a grand opportunity to reframe civilization to be both more humane and ecological. And that's what I was hoping that this transformational moment would bring about, but so far I haven't seen it. And it's rather a dark view to think that you know, we should be building our own lifeboats and we should start provisioning them now. But that's what I'm rather at. I think that history suggests that it takes a prolonged period of more or less intense suffering before people let go of an old paradigm and embrace a new one. And he talks about a metanoia, a form of soul change, only happens after we receive a profound shock or reach the end of our tether. And that transformation only occurs during a crisis in which the old verities and rules no longer apply, but the new ones are not yet in place. So we have to endure that shock. And right now, in answer to your question, Bill, I just don't think we're going to avoid that shock. I know that's an awful thing to say, and it goes against my hopeful arguments, but at the moment, it looks like we should be getting ready for that shock, and it will be a rolling shock, I think. And what's happening in British Columbia right now really frightens me.
Unprecedented. Have you attempted, as some of us have, to get through to the Prime Minister's office on these kinds of issues? Because he's completely out in, well, there's no question, some different field from the discussion we're having here. It just doesn't seem to penetrate any of the people in the cabinet, in the Privy Council.
Well, what we've tried to do and what we've concentrated on, and there are members from the Forum for Leadership of Water on this webinar with whom I work and for whom I have great respect. And what we have been working on for the last several years is a Canada Water Agency that will look at some of these things more seriously, and also orchestrate better cooperation between the provinces and the territories to deal with exactly what you're talking about. And also the reform of the Canada Water Act, which hasn't been altered for 50 years. Those are the things we've been at. But in terms of the larger sense of what you're talking about, we've had no success getting to the Prime Minister's office. And I'm just wondering if what we're seeing in British Columbia right now might be the threshold that we crossed to realize just how much trouble we're in. And maybe our political leaders will see that this is the real thing. And I think it is. And obviously you do too, Bill.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for being so upfront about this, Bob.
Thank you, Bill. Meg, if you will unmute yourself and ask your question, and Miles, you'll be up next.
Yes, thank you very much. You've put in very good words, some of my deepest concerns, and I think that what you're talking about is one of the most important things that is facing us these days. I'm trained originally as an engineer, and so to hear you talk about thermodynamics is fantastic, because what we hear out of the oil companies and various industries is completely counter to what thermodynamics would tell us are reasonable solutions. And it seems to me, after watching these kinds of issues in many venues, is that one of the largest objects in our way is simply that a lot of people make an awful lot of money out of technologies and ways of advancing their own interests that are counter to larger interests. So that's kind of the larger scope of it. But in terms of advancing technology or advancing larger projects that could be beneficial, and everything from seeding the ocean and so on is very unknown, and we're kind of playing with fire, but we're literally playing with fire anyway. So it's kind of desperate times. In some ways, these desperate times need desperate science. They need the strongest best trained scientist watching like a hawk what's happening. Something like the science table who's saying, no, the disease is going up in the water, and so we have to be careful. We need the people who can detect the potential that bad things are happening or that we're going in the right direction to direct things. So with that in mind, and knowing that water has a high heat capacity, it's so important for moderating temperatures. Do you have ideas about how we should or should not be attempting to retain water on landscapes so that we retain both the moisture and also that temperature modulation?
Well, first of all, you're completely right. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas in its own right. And then one question was asked about whether or not the increase in the carrying capacity of the atmosphere of 7% for each 10 degrees Celsius, if it was absolute or relative. Well, it's absolute. And so consequently, there's going to be a lot more water moving around the world much more quickly. In fact, we've accelerated the global water cycle so that it's no longer recognizable from what it was a century ago. So managing water is really important because it ties to so much else. I mean, water and agriculture are inseparable. And so consequently, if we enter into restorative agriculture and we build soil health, what happens is that deeper soils, for example, will hold more water vapor, not just more carbon dioxide because they're alive with microbes, but also absorb and retain more water, which does two things. It helps you in a drought because the soil moisture will remain as high as it can be longer. And it helps you in floods because those thick soils absorb that water. So these things are all related. So soil health, I think, is one of the underrated avenues toward not just improving the climate situation, but making the world more food secure and dealing with some of the crises that we're facing, and including absorbing the impacts of these climate events. So water certainly is part of that. Now, you had also mentioned that science has a huge role in this. Well, it does. But I also want to point out that I have indicated that I think fierce, relentless, informed citizenship is going to help us more, as much as, and probably more than just science alone. And
the citizens have to be informed.
Well, just that I just find sometimes it's really surprising, and I don't think it's just because I live in Alberta, that we're not very good civically, and therefore we're not very well informed on the issues, and we tend to be one issue oriented and focused on one thing. And I think that's not only hurting our democracy, I think it's threatening our ecosystems, and it's bringing the climate down around us.
Can I ask one brief follow-up?
Please.
Soil, the most used pesticide in Canada by manyfold is glyphosate. That's Roundup. Now, glyphosate is a herbicide that's used with genetically modified crops, which is the bulk of our food supply now. It is also patented and has previously been used as an antibiotic, which obviously has very bad impacts on the microbial content of soils. And it's also a chelating agent, which can mobilize toxic metals such as cadmium, which happens to be high in our potash. So in terms of agricultural renaissance or whatever, when you say regenerative agriculture, would that be an organic model?
Yes, it would be. And we have good examples of it, but it's not spreading fast enough. It's quite funny that you bring that whole issue up, especially about organic type farming. And I get invited to all sorts of conferences, and one of them was a soil conference, and they always take you out to see some farm, right? It's a really good model. And the one we went and visited was terrific. It was just unbelievable. Over 30 years, the farming family was able to make it far more profitable by being organic and staying away from the types of things you were talking about. But then I said to him, I said, well, okay, that's absolutely terrific. How many of the farmers that farm around you practice this? And he went, 20%. Then he went, no, probably 10%. Then he went, oh, I can't be criticizing my fellow neighbors for how they farm.
Mhm.
So you see that this is a delicate thing. And I'm sure some of
Okay,
you.
this is really, really important. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's another thing too that I want to explain. You can imagine that some of the things that I've said would not be taken charitably by the oil sector. And I understand that why. But you should try and take on big ag and see what that looks like. They're
I
like,
have, we're doing it.
yeah, okay, well, then you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about hardball here.
Mhm. Yep. And
Thank you, Meg. I'm
Yeah.
gonna cut it off there. Others are waiting. I just in light of the hour.
Yep.
Miles, if you would ask your question, and
Okay, thanks, Ruben.
uh,
Who's on deck?
Mary, you'll be on deck.
Okay, let's play hardball with Big Ag. My question is, a friend of mine, his name is Dr. Silas Rao. He has a PhD in systems engineering. He's got a position paper actually reported in Forbes recently. And the article says that Dr. Rao's position paper has been published in the Journal of Ecological Society. And what his position paper says is that meat and dairy are 87%, not 14.5%, 87% responsible for greenhouse gases. This has been published in this journal, as I said. If we don't want to read that, we can read Goodland and Engholm. They said meat and dairy is responsible for 51% of greenhouse gases. And this is because most everyone else is not including for the carbon opportunity cost, also known as deforestation, because in 12,000 years, humanity has been very good at demolition, controlled and uncontrolled, and we've wiped out 3 trillion trees from 6 trillion to today, 3 trillion. So I'm wondering, are you aware of these papers? Are you aware of the hundreds of gallons? Actually, I'm reading here, it takes 15,000 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of beef and 1,000 liters of drinking water to make 1 liter of milk, when the dairyman makes 28 cents a liter. Anyway, also tremendous amounts of pollution due to meat and dairy. Thoughts on that, Mr. Sandford? Thank you.
Well, certainly we've known about some of these measures for some time. I mean, and one of the things that I find are really, really interesting is that there's new statistics that are coming out all the time that really take into fuller account what the consequences are of our dietary habits and other habits in our society, which is helpful. And certainly we some of these measures are well known to us, but I think one of the things that I find really, really interesting about our time is that we're measuring more and more, and our measurements are getting more and more precise, but they're not penetrating the public consciousness. You can tell them all those things that you just said to me, and most people just, yeah. So this tells us 2 things. One is that the way we're going to probably have the best documented, most fully scientifically covered societal collapse in all of human history. That's one aspect. Or the other thing that more positively should come out of this is that we need better narratives. We need to tell stories, not just give statistics. And all of us are faced with that right now. And I think one of the reasons why it's so important now to listen to Indigenous wisdom is that they often know how to tell stories masterfully, and we need to be better at it so that we don't just assault people with statistics. We give them a reason to change their view.
Wonderful answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Barry, if you would ask your question, and Bill, Tyson, you'll be up next, and that will be the last question from the group. So.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Barry Bruce, and I work a lot of the time now having spent 48 years as a family physician, trying to bring about changes in climate change through agricultural methods. And so you pretty much answered my question. My question was, what is the potential for agricultural transformation in mitigating climate change? And almost immediately somebody said, there's no potential within this group. I saw it in the chat. So I'm not sure. So I think there may be potential from a technically potential, but is there really any potential from a societal standpoint? Can we change our nutritional habits to being more plant-based? Can we do it quickly enough? Can we convince monocroppers, for example, which is the dominant form of agriculture in the world, to cover their soil better, to do no-till farming, and how can we convince those types of farmers to use alternatives that are easier on the planet?
Well, my view on that hasn't changed much in the last 2 decades. Clearly, there is a movement toward it. I think there's more and more thought being given into organic farming, more and more appetite for the products. People are willing to pay more for them. People are changing their diets slowly. So I think there is potential. Your question really revolves about whether or not we do it in time. And I'll be really honest with you. I have been saying at soil conferences, and boy, I'm really popular for this. I mean, and this is well known in the UN circle and also globally in highest levels of agricultural science. Industrial agriculture, as we practice it now, is self-terminating. We have to change it.
I think so. Yeah, so is oil and gas.
So we have to change them.
Yeah. There's no choice. That's what I think.
Thank you. Bill Tyson.
Yeah, hi, excellent talk. You've been compared to Churchill. I think a more appropriate one would be one of the more eloquent Old Testament prophets. We're really facing a sad situation. I think it was Pogo who said, "We have seen the enemy and he is us." I think that's the core of the problem. We just have too many people on the planet. You pointed out that there's a gorilla, the climate change, entering the ring after COVID, but there are a whole slew of gorillas lined up behind him. There's depletion of the oceans, deforestation, a whole host of problems that are all associated with the fact that we have too many people on the planet. I think inevitably we've got to decrease the number of people that we have everywhere on this planet, and I'm only concerned that we may degrade things so much that it's hardly worth doing. We're going to be leaving a planet that's too hot with species depletion, and I'm not sure it's going to be a pleasant place to live. End of message. Sorry.
Well, I should just tell you, and I'm sure some of you have had this similar experience. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about population and what should be done about it and how it's going to move around, and it's going to affect Canada, this migration, as was pointed out. And I'll tell you, if you want to find yourself alone in a conference room in an international basis, or if you want to find yourself sitting by yourself at a dinner party, bring up population.
That's the problem.
It's just something that it's a taboo to bring it up.
It's the gorilla in the room, and no one will address it.
It is.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, I see Barry Bruce's point here: educate women, let them work. Moving toward, I mean, this is where the Sustainable Development Goals really matter, because they're all linked together. And educating women, gender equity, equality, better agricultural practices, all of these things are linked together. And I think it's really important to see that really is a blueprint that could get us out of that jam. And what I find so frustrating sometimes is you go to countries, and even Canada's like this. Oh, yeah, we've heard about them, and we tacitly check the box, but they're not doing them. And it's a way of thinking about integrating all of our activities together and moving in the same direction toward the same end, a habitable, safe, just planet. And all of these things are linked. So we should try and use the frameworks that we have and try and understand how something as simple as educating women widely can have such a long-term impact on so many things positively. It's not just population, but it's a whole range of things that are right through all of the SDGs and make the world a better place. So those are subtle, fundamental things that may not seem related, but they really are.
Thank you, Bob. I'm going to ask you what will be the final question before we close the formal part of this. And it would be, if you had an opportunity to advise the Prime Minister, and the attitude he was taking is, I am open to any scale of advice as long as it makes significant differences for the future we both care about. What might that advice be? What would you have the Prime Minister do?
Well, it's difficult because, you don't want to walk into the Prime Minister's office and give him such a large order that it's just absolutely impossible. When we've just spent an hour and a half talking about how complex, many different facets there are to this problem. And I would advise the Prime Minister to look at the roots of the climate crisis and see it perhaps through a lens of water, and see all the manifold ways in which we need to change our society to avoid further consequences of the kind that we are seeing right now in British Columbia. And I would ask the Prime Minister to reorganize his government so that all of the departments have a responsibility in moving toward those kinds of solutions. And that's how I would start. But I would like to talk to Christy at Freeland while I'm at it.
Good, thank you. It's as host of this session, Bob, and as a friend and colleague, I want to thank you on behalf of all of us who've been part of this session. And thank you on behalf of all of those who will watch it on video later without an opportunity to engage in conversation with you. You have been informative, but more than that, you have touched us and been inspiring. And for that, I am grateful. And so is CACOR. And so I will turn this over to Art, who will talk a little bit about CACOR and what's coming up.
I want to thank you very much, Ruben, for all your encouragement and for your help with this, and for arranging the invitation, and CACOR for having me. Thank you.